Hello and welcome to the first episode that's going to be talking about Hekagrim. This will get you caught up to speed to understand what players would be going into when we do talk about player stories. These player stories will also have some other fun elements added to them as well. I'm planning to actually get some of the players themselves to actually come and talk about their time role-playing as the characters in Hekagrim. This is specifically because Hekagrim, while not ended, is pseudo in an area where it's hiatus. Everyone's at a point in which they can technically stop, but there are still story threads to be had for all of them, and I'll get into that individually once we get into that. Now, before any of that, you guys need to know about the world of Hekagrim. Hekagrim is a story that I made like many years ago back in middle school, and we were all really just kids trying to figure out how to tell a good story, something that could be played by a player and have choices that matter. I originally was going to call it The Tales of Hekagrim. So my first few attempts at making this game, I actually was trying to create wide branching pathways that you would never have the same story twice going through if you chose different pathways. Some that even had it so that the tutorial could have characters die for the rest of the game, and that would be a completely different game. That was my concept for Tales of Hekagrim. But something so grand, of course, fell through, and I was being burnt out because the way I was making it was RPG Maker, and I was feeling as if no one's going to play it because of that reason. That is what Hekagrim was. But what is it now? Now it's a long-lasting roleplay session that made it into a living world. Various players went through this world, changed it in their own special ways, and created stories. In Hekagrim, there's a large amount of wars that all occurred, and roughly a time period that no one necessarily needs to know about. But it was rather quick. I had a timeline and everything back in the day. We had war after war after war. Mentally, I was in a terrible spot when making the story, so maybe that's why I make most of my world so glum, but that's when we get into how players altered it. But let's first talk about the land masses. In Hekagrim, there are two main continents that exist, the two main continents being Europu and Serip. Most of the players started in Europu. In fact, I don't think a single one started in Serip. There were many themes that I was trying to convey with my story to tell everyone inside of my friend group. Every time that we ever had any of the discussions, RPs, and whatever with this world, I would want to have some form of theme. Europu and Serip, inside of this context, represented the technological pursuit of man and the spiritual pursuit of man. In Europu, everything was about technology rising. At first it was because we had to survive using technology, but then it became because we can. While in Serip, it was all about spirituality, connecting with nature, being able to understand one another, that type of ideology, but at the same time having a city known as Mysore City that was an underbelly of crime and also of a lot of other issues that were not being handled by the government that was inside Serip. In Serip, they practiced what was basically an ancestral worship, which will be talked about in the magic for reasons that you'll understand when we get to it. In Europu, industry and technology were booming, and because of it, it caused a lot of the housing and structure to raise up as well. They were able to actually establish themselves quite strongly, but the cause of doing so was because of constant warfare and having to advance quickly in order to survive. The majority of the population there being Euros, so in a way, Europu became the technological head and Serip became the spiritual head. Terrain-wise, both of them had basically the same types of terrain, but in different ways, though albeit Serip having much more forest, majority of it being forest, and Europu having a better mix of everything. So in Serip, the great vast forest that was there is because of the government having a law in which that only specific people can cut down trees and only if they have certain reasons. It was a whole thing involving ancestor worship, which again we're going to get into a little bit. Other than trees, it also had a mountain range on the north side that was going to go into a snowy area. Now, the weather inside this world is a little bit funny. It's not going off of weather patterns as normal worlds do. It goes off of something because of how magic interacts with the world itself, creating areas that would normally not be where they are After we talk about the mountains and the snow, we can also talk about the deserts. The deserts is on the eastern part of the map, cut off by the mountains, which over the mountains still has snow. The snowy region is an area that no one really goes to. I say that, but I'll explain later about something that is special with it. The forest area is where majority of the people are. There is a grasslands that is more like a Sahara between a place that is basically known as the burned patch and the desert. The burned patch was created in a war that I'm going to go into in the general history segment, but there's a giant burned patch of ashen fields that stayed around for multiple years because of the fires that were used on it being so hot that anything that tries to be there just turns into embers. That's the lore behind it. Nowadays, people can technically go through. It just is a hot area with still ash that is everywhere. Since I just explained what Slypherz should look like, I'm going to now talk about Europu. In Europu, the western area is snow. It has a mountain range cutting it off from the rest of the continent. When you go past the mountain range, you would be able to see grasslands. After grasslands, we have forests in the south and a desert to the east. And above the desert, we have a rocky plains of sorts. Something that you can grow some crops in, root vegetables and such, but not where a lot of life can survive. If you are using the map I'm thinking you will be using, then there should be a crater as well. This giant crater that happened inside of the RP due to the player's actions and due to, well, other interventions. You also may notice that there's a little nubbin on the northern part of Europu, and that was a man-made area that creates what is known as Taika Academy, a special little area that I'll go into because it's a big part of history. And this covers landmasses. The wildlife of the world is interesting because before the RP begins, I explain how wildlife is dwindling. As the RP occurred, wildlife disappeared. But recently, a resurgence is occurring. These are the three phases of wildlife that have happened during the RP's lifetime, and I won't explain why because that's part of the mystery and that is actually a fun part for me. But I will say this. Wildlife was dwindling as a creature known as the Tenebrosi were rising. Tenebrosi are creatures of darkness. Dark magic infused into an animal that creates a creature of horror. These creatures came about, guess when? Right after the dark period, the same time that the Hybridians suddenly arrived as well. Some stuff might have happened in that time period that might be interesting to look into. Anyway, Tenebrosi have been studied and researched by players and NPCs alike, and no one knows fully where they come from. But what they do know is that dark magic was involved in their creation of some form. The world could have produced it using dark magic, or people could have manufactured them using dark magic, but dark magic created them in some form. Tenebrosi also have the abilities of regeneration at times. There's going to be some pictures of Tenebrosis that are being shown right now, drawn by my fiance. The most common being the wolf one, which may have a white fur skin there, but normally they have purple skin and purple hairs. Tenebrosi in general tend to be purple in coloration or black in coloration, usually one of the two. Tenebrosi are an interesting creature to research. They feast upon the terror. They target negative emotion. And if they can sense it, they go towards it. They are a creature that seek to snuff out life for the fun of it. They don't eat because they are hungry. They do not need to eat. They can survive endlessly. They kill because that's what they are made for. And wildlife started to dwindle as they rose, and they never stopped growing. However, wildlife is now resurging after a period of extinction, and no one knows why. Perhaps this is the hope. Tenebrosi have devastated lives, and they're a threat that have been ongoing since the dark period. And that is the end for this video. Next time we're going to be talking about race. Oh great, I'm sure nothing bad can come from that. Thank you for listening, and I hope you guys all have a great day. If you have any questions for me about anything I've discussed inside this video, please ask below in the comments and I will discuss it as best as I can. Otherwise, I hope that you guys have a wonderful day. Goodbye.